passing glance, a wistful gaze, a confident look. Tina Barney's portraits give us a glimpse of the soul of her subjects. She's been honing that singular perspective from behind her traditional tripod setup for more than 4 decades. Barney's latest exhibition at the Jeu de Paume Gallery in Paris is called Family Ties, a nod to some of her favourite subjects: children, siblings, parents, often taking part in the rites and rituals of their social strata and passing down those traditions to the next generation. Tina Barney, hello.
Hello, how are you today?
Good, thank you. Now, if we look at your body of work, it presents an almost anthropological study of a certain demographic within American society. How would you describe that group in your own words, and why did you want to zoom in on them?
I would say most of them are Upper East Side or New England, United States of America. And that's where I live, that's where my family's from, that's where my friends are from. And that's why I focused on them, because they were right there and easy for me to photograph and find.
There are a couple of images in this exhibition, Graham Cracker Box, Sunday New York Times, from the early 1980s, which really represented a turning point in your career. I believe that a lot of attention came to your work. What do you think it was about those images that really struck people at that time?
Well, let's start off by the fact of the size of the photograph, which was historical in the history of photography. So start with that. The color always. And the fact of what the camera I was using created. That I think the average person has no idea what that camera does and what it's capable of. And also the composition that I thought about in depth, where I placed the people, where I stood, etc.
Working with a large format, dark chamber camera allows her to pull away somewhat, to take a step to one side, away from the scene, and to capture it a bit like an anthropologist. Let's put it simply. Her photography presents a very comfortable social class, the rich. And that was very striking for many American critics in the 1980s. It was the time of the neoliberal revolution, Ronald Reagan, TV series like Dallas and Dynasty, which were showing us the sagas of those large, wealthy families. It was a time of brands and their advertising, which also immortalized the wealthy in their imagery. So Tina Barney's photos defy categorization, both because the upper classes was a subject that had very rarely been dealt with in photography, but also because she seemed to come at it from a non-critical stance.
Interior space is something that often comes up in your work, a very personal use of interiors. Can you tell us how you approach an interior space?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with, number one, that my mother was an interior decorator. So I was surrounded by, I think, extraordinary interiors my whole life. She also had a special, unique sense of color that was remarked by people that knew her. And so I chose to photograph interiors that were interesting to me. But a lot of those interiors happened to be my sister, who inherited that same taste of my mother or friends.
We see details that indicate wealth and privilege in your images, the decor or perhaps people's clothing, but also behavior, gestures. Can you tell us about how you use body language in the pictures you make?
Sometimes I would tell someone to do something just to get them moving, and parts of the picture would be directed by me in a very, very simple way, and others I call gifts, the accident that would happen. And I didn't take a lot of pictures, frames or sheets of film at each shoot, but I tried to do as many sheets as I could, because the ratio of success is very slim, very slim.
For example, can you tell us a little about the positioning of these two figures here?
Okay, so the first choice is the vantage point or viewpoint, and that is where I stand, where I decide to put my camera, which defines the vantage point not only technically but also conceptually. And I knew that I wanted this line of the sink to go down the middle of the frame to bring the eye, as if there was a line I had drawn, to bring the eye of the viewer towards the center of the photograph. And there have been books written about visual perception that call The Power of the Center. And I had studied that. So I had that line of the sink. Then I saw the line of the seam of the mirror. So you've got two very strong lines going to the center of the image. Then you have the line going across of the radiator, but then you have the repetition of the line of the fence. So there are all these structural marks that excite the eye of the viewer. And I had been doing a lot of reading about this from Dutch 17th century painters and on to sort of learn more about it. But then I call this the icing on the cake is that brush, which I tilted out. And the Dutch 17th century painters did this kind of device all the time. So I tell Jill to stand in the middle, and then I tell Polly to come look forward. And the gift, again, is the reason I go back to my sister over and over is, number one, she's my sister, but also the couple of people that I went back to over and over were oblivious to the camera. And that doesn't happen all the time.
We see many very American scenes in this exhibition, but you did an important series, Europeans, where you photograph a similar milieu, haute bourgeoisie, we'd say, in French, upper classes. What did you observe about the major differences between Americans and Europeans when you were making those photographs?
Well, let's start by saying that I did not know the people in Europe before I met them. So that's one, I would say, a problem. Number two, I realized very quickly, the second I entered their houses, that they were more formal, more reserved, more polite. And so that changed a whole lot of things. The good part was that I realized, and this took a while to realize, that the tradition, the ritual of having a portrait made in the history of Europe was such a part of their lives and their history that they didn't even question what I was doing and who I was or anything. Well, the person that introduced us was very important, of course, that they trusted that friend. But that also what was interesting is they almost posed in an extraordinarily professional way, as if they had subconsciously maybe imitated the portraits that were surrounding their houses that they had lived with from birth, and on and on.
Class and status are perhaps elements that make up identity or maybe tribalism, and some of that feeds into the culture wars that we see today. America is poised to elect a new president. How do you see the question of class or social status as we look ahead to this vote?
I don't think about it because I think the world is pretty much of a mess. And I sort of feel as if I've done my kind of job. I've done all I can do. It probably doesn't interest me anymore. But where I live, in this place that I've photographed most of my life, this is probably not strange, but not much has changed.
Sometimes a portrait reveals something about the sitter or the subject that they didn't know about themselves, or they hadn't seen, or we'd never noticed. You've made some fantastic self-portraits. Did you discover things about yourself in that process?
Well, the reason I made self-portraits is because I realized in the history of art that self-portraits usually end up being the most important work that an artist makes. In photography, and I've said this many times, it's more difficult because of the focus problem, is how are you going to, if you're alone, how are you going to focus your own self? And I think the portraits I did is I was alone. I wanted to be alone. What I knew by making portraits of other people is that what was important is, number one, the eyes, and what you tell the subject to think about or do. And I asked them to think of a very specific narrative or situation, because otherwise you start daydreaming. And you can see when someone's daydreaming and getting bored.
at a time when people are taking photographs with their smartphones. We have a very particular, most people have a particular relationship with taking and sharing photographs, almost hyperactive. It seems very much at odds with your very considered approach. What do you make of this hyper-saturated image era that we seem to live in now?
Well, I think it's pretty horrifying. I mean, I look at Instagram all the time and it's fun. But I don't think there's anything good about it. That's all I can say.
And when tools like Photoshop or AI mean that some images are manipulated or entirely fabricated, do you think we have the same relationship with photographs today? Do they have the same integrity? Can we trust them?
No, of course not. No. But, you know, you're talking about a different animal from my photographs to the general photograph, just because of not a trust in the image. It'll never be the same.
Tina Barney, thank you very much.
Thank you.